legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is David Fideler, who joins us to discuss modern life and ancient wisdom. The difficulties in our lives are defined by our reaction to them, and there are many more problems in our minds than in reality. But the modern materialistic worldview dictates that life, the world, and the entire cosmos are devoid of meaning or purpose, and so we seek them in possessions, status, and the pursuit of pleasure. As a result, many people live in a state of permanent anxiety, constantly comparing themselves to others while dreaming of some golden future which is forever just over the horizon. However, the best possible life isn't just about contentment. With challenge comes opportunity, whilst doggedly avoiding challenges simply leads to stasis and stagnation. The question is how we meet our challenges, and whether we use them for growth and progress, or simply cast around for someone or something to blame. In the end, freedom is a state of mind, and looking at the world through a different lens is both liberating and life-affirming, everything that our moribund consumer culture is not. Hello and welcome, David, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, it's great to be with you, Greg.
It's been many years, actually. It was around the time you published Restoring the Soul of the World, and that was quite some time ago.
Right. It's been a long time since we spoke.
Exactly. So before we get started today, just to say a few words to listeners who are not familiar with you. Tell them about your background and your work in general.
Okay. So ever since I was quite young, actually in my late teens, I started in ancient religions, and I studied ancient philosophy academically when I was in school. That was many decades ago. And in recent years, the past 15 years, I've been quite interested in Stoicism, which is a Hellenistic philosophy. It's become very popular recently, and I started reading Seneca, who was one of the big three Roman Stoics. So this new book, it's called Breakfast with Seneca because I developed this little ritual of reading Seneca each morning when I would go out for breakfast. And it's basically an introduction to his thought by topic and an introduction to Stoicism in general.
Now, as I've set out in my recorded introduction, this is not per se a discussion about Seneca, Stoic philosophy, or indeed any other, abstract look at philosophy. This is very much about applying certain eternal ideas, really, to everyday life. Ideas that were relevant in Seneca's time, indeed prior to that, and are very relevant today. And in many ways, I'd like to say, for many people, philosophy is kind of alien to them. They've maybe never encountered it, or if they have, as mentioned, it's been presented in a very abstract way, and it's been difficult for most people to see how this applies to their everyday life, and that is a problem in philosophy, as you point out in the book. But what I like to say is, really, at the end of the day, we're all philosophers.
Mm-hmm,
and
yes.
That doesn't mean just that if you engage in thinking about big questions, life, the universe, and everything. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Yeah, those are philosophical questions. But really, anybody who has engaged in, some sort of self-reflection about their own life, whether it's been triggered by, an adverse event or something really positive or not, anybody who's just thought about their position in the world, or where they're going and why they're doing what they're doing, they're engaging in philosophy.
Exactly. Right. Right. And the thing that's really appealing to people about Stoicism is that it's a philosophy of life, and it's based on very, practical types of issues. For example, like how to live a life that's actually worth living, so that when you're on your deathbed and dying, you're not thinking, oh, I regret the life that I lived. Instead, you would feel that you lived a very worthwhile life and feel grateful for it.
Yeah, well, that's the practical value of philosophy, as mentioned. Perhaps we could say a word. I mentioned that, these ideas that Seneca was expounding. Yes, he had his own take on them, and he really added something to that school of thought. But perhaps we could say something about that thread of ideas which extend back to before his time.
Right. Well, as you said, these are perennial ideas, and the Stoics certainly didn't invent all of their philosophy. They drew on earlier philosophers. It started around 300 BC in Athens, and the founder of Stoicism actually studied at Plato's academy. But there were several basic teachings about Stoic philosophy, and one of them was that if you wanted to live a happy life, this goes back to the very beginning, is that you want to live in agreement with nature, which had a lot of different interpretations, but the Stoics saw human beings as being rational creatures, and they saw the universe as being rational as well. So living in agreement with nature meant living a rational life and also developing your capacity to be rational. And the type of philosophy that Stoicism is it's so-called virtue ethics, because the whole purpose of it is to virtue sounds very Victorian and quaint, but what virtue means is it just means that something is excellent. And the whole point of like Roman Stoicism was to develop the excellence of your character. And the Stoics felt that that was actually the primary good in life, rather than, for example, buying a lot of things. Seneca had these really, he was actually one of the most wealthy people in the world, but it seems like he got quite tired of wealth and the wealthy people around him. So he had all of these satirical things to say about consumerism and materialism. He was actually the first philosopher he was actually like a proto-psychologist, and he was the first person to look at the psychology of consumerism. So the main goal of Stoicism in Roman times was to live a life that was truly worth living and to develop your inner character, because they believed that virtue was the only true good, and that the things in the external world, obviously we need them, but we're not going to use them in good ways if we don't have a good inner character. So it's like money, for example, is just something that they would see as, well, they would see it as being an advantage that you would want to have, but it's not intrinsically good in itself, because people can use money to do very bad things, or you can use it for good things. So the primary emphasis in Stoicism was really on developing the excellence of one's inner character.
Yeah, you've mentioned money and you mentioned consumerism, but there's nothing in this way of thinking about the world that, as you say, excludes those things. It's not some kind of monastic ideal, or, turning inwards at the expense of the outer world, or, material things are necessarily bad. It's really about balance, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Right, right. And the Stoics, like Plato before them, believed in 4 primary virtues, which, we call the cardinal virtues. So they were interested in developing wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice. And those were the 4 primary virtues. And basically, one of the ideas of Stoicism is that you want to develop a good character in life, but when you do develop a good character, then you also develop a sense of inner tranquility or equanimity, so that you're able to live a good, meaningful life under any conditions. And things in the world are much less likely to upset you.
One thing that's clear from reading about Seneca, who, by the way, I'd heard of but not read prior to receiving your book, is that, well, this might be stating the obvious, but human nature really hasn't changed in that time, or since his time, or indeed since the time of the Greek philosophers you mentioned. And why would it really? That time span is barely a blink of an eye in terms of the history of modern humans on the earth. And but I think people, because we think so short term, particularly since in the last few hundred years with a materialistic worldview, we think in such short time spans that people feel very disconnected, or that it's very difficult to relate to their contemporaries. Even from 2,000 years ago, it feels almost like the creatures from another planet, but they're really not.
Right. There have been a lot of changes, of course, in terms of the evolution of technology, but in terms of human psychology and human nature, this is one of the things that anyone will feel if they start reading like Seneca or his letters. He wrote 124 letters to a friend of his, but he also wrote all these essays. He was very people focused. So, unlike an academic today who might, give lectures to people, Seneca addressed all of his philosophical writings to people who were friends of his or family members. But if you do start reading Seneca's writings, you'll see immediately that he's like a contemporary person, because he's concerned with the same issues that everyone today is, how to live a happy life, how to deal with extremely negative emotions, how to deal with emotions like anger, greed, envy, things like that. And then all of the Stoics were very pro-social, so they wanted to make the world a better place. So that's something that people obviously still want to do. So really, in terms of our inner psychological lives, we're basically the same as, the people living back then. It just jumps off the page at you. There's one funny example of that towards the beginning of the book, where I mentioned earlier that Seneca was the first psychologist of consumerism, but he even describes the phenomenon of keeping up with the Joneses. And he says that if only a few people did something, we could easily ignore it. But when the majority starts to act in a certain way, we'll buy the same things that they do just because they've bought them. And we mistakenly believe that something is more honorable just because more people do it.
Yeah, and you see that at play very much. Anybody listening to this can relate to that, can't they? Whether they've observed it, engaged in it, or both. And that,
right, of course, yeah.
And that takes me back to what I was saying about, talking about materialism, consumerism. Materialism in both senses of the word, as a worldview, but also as a way of conducting yourself, as a way of behaving, a way of living. That's often pitched against the idea of meaning and purpose. So for a lot of people don't believe there is any meaning or purpose in life, or the world or existence. And so they I guess they find a substitute for that of sorts in consumerism and having things and being things. And, but those, as mentioned, those things are not mutually exclusive. To explore the possibility of meaning and purpose in life, you don't have to go and sit in a mountaintop or live in a cave.
Right.
But at the same time, if you just dive into materialist consumerist culture and advertising of what's sold to us and how we're told we should live, you're unlikely to find a meaning in your life or a sense of purpose.
I think the way Seneca would explain it is that there's nothing wrong in material things or making use of the gifts of fortune. And by fortune, what he meant is something that comes to us from nature or from chance. The Stoics had this really fundamental view that some things are up to us or within our control, and other things are not up to us. And if you really analyze what's up to us, according to the Stoics, it comes down to a very, very small number of things, basically like the judgments that we're able to make about things and our own decision-making process and our will. And modern Stoics call that the dichotomy of control, because if you realize that something is not really up to you and it seems to go wrong in some way, you don't have to feel upset about it. The thing that you need to pay attention to is what is up to you, because that allows you to live a meaningful life. And the way that Seneca described it, he described it a little differently. He used the terms virtue versus fortune. And basically, virtue is anything to do with your inner life or character, so that's up to you. And fortune is anything that has to do with the external world, chance occurrences, and basically anything that isn't within your inner sphere. And that includes our possessions, money, things like that. And what Seneca said is that you should deeply appreciate all the gifts of fortune that you have. So if you have wealth, a nice house, a nice family, those are advantages that you should desire, but you have to keep in mind that they're just gifts of fortune or gifts of the universe, and that all these gifts are really on loan to us from the universe. So you can enjoy them while you have them, but you have to realize that every gift that's given to us will someday be taken back by the universe, including our own lives.
So Seneca was born into a wealthy family, and as you say, he was part of the political power structure in Rome, an advisor to emperor no less, and in his day one of the wealthiest men in the world. And in what way does he address? Of course, we're talking about him in particular, but that's just a metaphor for this way of thinking in general. But does he say anything about this approach to life for people who have next to nothing, people for whom material existence is a struggle? There's many examples in history and in myth of people taking this approach to life when they, as I say, materially they have nothing. They may be living in very adverse circumstances, and
right.
Every moment's a struggle. So some people might think, well, it's easy for someone, in the high castle, sort of with, material concerns, are not a worry, never have been, likely never will be, to speak about these things in this way.
Right. Well, actually, historically, the most famous Stoic philosopher after Seneca, when Seneca died, he was just a teenager. He was living in Rome. He may have been like around 15 years old, was Epictetus. And Epictetus was a slave. His name, Epictetus in Greek, means owned. So, I'm sure that, the person that owned him at the time took good care of him, probably. Eventually, he sent him to study philosophy, and then he became a free person. This is something we should talk about a little later, maybe towards the end of the discussion about freedom in Stoicism, because that was a very important concept, and your podcast is called Legalized Freedom.
Yeah, it is. It's just, I do have that down as a note at the end, actually, so we can come back to that.
Yeah. But what Seneca realized is that the gifts of fortune are very ephemeral, and you might be wealthy like him one day, and you might lose all of your wealth the next day. In fact, that happened to him when he was 45 years old. Basically, he lived under a whole string of bad emperors like Caligula, who wanted to kill him. And then he was exiled to the island of Corsica by Claudius for 8 years, and on trumped up charges. There was nothing to it. But when you were exiled from Rome in ancient times, you lost immediately half of your wealth. He was married, so he lost his wife. And this happened 2 weeks after his only child died when the child was a baby. So this was quite common back then. Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic philosopher as well, he was the emperor of the Roman Empire later. He had 13 children, and only 5 lived to adulthood. So Seneca was, very aware that these gifts of fortune were very ephemeral. And the Stoics, to go back to your question, it is possible, according to the Stoics, to live a worthwhile life, even if you do lack, for example, like money or a lot of possessions and things like that. And that's why they said that virtue was the only true good, because things are only good if they possess virtue or they're influenced by it. For example, Seneca said, if you have a lot of wealth, the wealth doesn't make you virtuous, but you can use it to exercise your virtue if you use your wealth in a wise way. And when they said that virtue was the only true good, they were trying to make a point about how egalitarian Stoic philosophy was, because before the Stoics, Aristotle said that in order to lead a good life, you need external goods. So you need a certain amount of money, and he even said, maybe you need good looks as well, to have a really good life, which is quite silly, because Socrates was said to have been the most virtuous philosopher ever, and he looked pretty ugly and had a pug nose and was compared to resembling a satyr. But I think the Stoics were right about that, because imagine that you had developed a good character over your life, you were virtuous, you had led a meaningful life, but then you suddenly get old and you've lost all of your wealth, your family members have died, you're left all alone in a room somewhere, you have nothing, you have no external goods at all. But does that mean that suddenly you went from having an excellent life or inner character to leading a bad life? Well, the Stoics would say no, because the excellence of your character remains untouched by your external circumstances. That's why they said that even someone who was a slave could unfortunately be enslaved physically, but they could still be free internally.
Yeah, and you can flip that around to your external circumstances. Don't change your inner character. Well, great wealth or extreme wealth. I mean, you can see that throughout the ages, but certainly today, there's absolutely nothing inherently in the billions and billions that some of the richest people on earth now have, increasingly so as well, as money continues to funnel upwards into fewer and fewer hands. There's nothing inherently virtuous in any of the world's billionaires.
Right. Well, to take that metaphor of slavery, you can flip that around too, because on the one hand, the Stoics said that a slave could be free internally, whereas they use slavery as a metaphor for what we might call addiction today. So people are addicted to wealth, or they're addicted to pleasures, or something like that. And that would be a state of psychological slavery for the Stoics.
Now, there's a story that I like to relate. Well, I don't like, it's very horrendous. It goes back many, many years, but it was a newspaper story that I read, and the exact details are hazy, but it doesn't matter. It detailed here in the UK and England, a wealthy businessman who had lost everything. I don't know whether it was, a business went wrong, but in any event, lost everything. And he had a large house in the country, and there's little details I remember, like he had, him and his wife and children, that they had stables there with horses, because either his wife and or his daughters or whatever liked horses. If you're keeping horses, you got to be fairly well off. And right. He said, had this, that, and the other thing, and it just detailed his wealth. Lost everything, and what he did was, and this is why it was such a shocking story, was he also had guns, which is unusual here in the UK, and I don't know how his family felt about the loss of their wealth, but he shot all of them dead and then shot himself.
Right.
Because they'd lost everything. And I just remember thinking, what a tragic waste. I said, you have everything, the most valuable things you have are that you have your wife and children. And it was just such a shocking, extreme example of the place where people can go to if their material wealth and their consumerist way of life is what they base their identity on, or where they derive some kind of meaning and purpose. If that all goes away, what are they left with if they haven't cultivated anything else within themselves?
Right. Well, when the great stock market crash happened in the 1920s, there were lots of people jumping out of windows because they had lost, what they thought was everything of value, their wealth. But the story that you just told is even more extreme because the fellow believed that I'm going to take my family members with me because they couldn't possibly be happy without wealth either. And what the Stoics believed, and this is something that makes it very interesting, is that basically almost all human suffering and extreme negative emotions are based on cognitive errors. They're based on errors of belief. And so if you're experiencing a, extreme emotional state or some kind of suffering, if you analyze your underlying beliefs, you can actually remove the negative emotion. And I think that story that you recounted is a very good example of that, because obviously the fact that this person lost all of his wealth was not the end of his life. That was just a distorted belief. And one of the most famous sayings of Stoicism is that it's not things or events that upset us, it's our opinions about things. And that's actually called the cognitive theory of emotion. And one of the most effective forms of psychotherapy is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it was actually, that entire school of philosophy was based on that fundamental Stoic belief. The people who founded cognitive behavioral therapy were aware of Stoic philosophy, and they said this actually makes sense, and we can use this to create a form of psychotherapy.
I remember something that my grandfather used to say. If he thought I was engaging in wrong-headed thinking, usually if I was upset about something or I thought something had gone wrong, but it usually wasn't completely reality-based. So it'd be like, as you say, my interpretation of events. He would say, in reaction to what I'd said, he said, "You only think that."
Exactly, right.
And I used to it took me a while to wrap my head around that when I was young. You only think that. I said, what do you mean I only think that? Then I realized, well, yeah, because that's what I'm thinking. So, but that doesn't make it so.
Right. Seneca said there are more things that upset us in our imaginations than actually upset us in the real world. So, we often imagine these things that are going to happen that never happen, and that creates a lot of suffering. Most of anxiety actually is based on worrying about the future, which hasn't even arrived yet. And so the Stoics developed these different psychological and therapeutic practices to deal with these kinds of emotions, to sort of like deconstruct them and to keep extremely negative emotions from even coming into being. So there's this great misunderstanding about Stoicism because people think that, because the word Stoic has changed over the centuries, and people think that it has to do with like suppressing your emotions or keeping a stiff upper lip. And it had nothing to do with that at all, because the Stoics understood that, suppressing emotions is, absolutely unhealthy. They would have never recommended it. But, and they accepted all sorts of like natural human feelings, but they felt that extreme, violent, negative emotions were harmful, and they were based on cognitive errors, and that rather than suppressing them, if you could actually understand them rationally, you could deconstruct the beliefs on which they were based and essentially neutralize the negative emotion.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people associate Stoicism with basically putting up with any crap, which is like, and not doing anything about it. It's just kind of, well, it's a balance that has to be struck. There's a hurricane and your house is destroyed. You can have a certain attitude to that and what you're going to do about it. But it's like, how do you engage with what's happened? How do you think about what has happened? And where do you go from that? Rather than thinking about, who do I blame for this, And, I have been wronged, rather than this is just, it's an act of God, an act of force of nature. But the Stoic approach to life does not mean, as they just putting up with anything, allowing people to walk over you, allowing yourself to be treated badly, not speaking up, not taking action, for redress.
Right. Yeah, actually, one of the most appealing aspects of Stoicism is that they felt that everyone faces different things. So you're facing a particular situation. It could be anything, and that's the starting point. And then how do you respond to that? For example, the example you gave of a hurricane, destroying your house. First of all, a Stoic would have some kind of emotional reaction to it. They would try to keep it from turning into something that was devastating or that would like topple their ability to think or their, entire personality. But one of the very appealing things about Stoicism is that they had this belief that we could face any negative situation and always find some good in it, but in terms of how we respond to it. Because if we respond to a situation in a virtuous way, that's a way of bringing, good into the world under any circumstances. So let's say you're walking down the road one night and you smell some smoke or something and you see like a light ahead. And then as you get closer, you see that, there's a car accident and someone's been seriously injured. Well, most people would consider that to be, some kind of tragedy or a really bad situation. It's certainly not a good one. But the way a Stoic would respond to it is they would try to save the person's life. And so, if you were able to help the person who was injured in the car accident or save their life or get help, then that would have been a way to display virtue, and you would have taken, a very negative situation and you would have created some good out of it. No matter how bad a situation might be, based on the way that you respond to it, you can bring some goodness into the world. I think that's really inspiring. I love that.
Well, this is sort of an extension of what we talked about earlier, about what we can and cannot control. Which you present in the book, sort of 8 axioms of Stoicism, that being one of them. And what you just mentioned highlights another, which is the idea of opportunity and adversity, which again, for a lot of people, it's like, let's just focus on the adversity exclusively because that's what, that's what's hitting us emotionally and psychologically.
Exactly right.
And, but it is very important. And it seems sometimes like, and I notice this attitude quite a lot, somebody's going through a difficult time, you say, focus on what you can control, not what you can't, what you can do, not what you can't do. And there's sort of a strange psychological resistance to that, or psychological and emotional resistance to that with people. Like, that's not what I want to hear, which is unusual. And if someone's experiencing adversity, say, well, what can come out of this? And it's almost like, I don't want to think like that. It's almost like I want to wallow in the adversity and what I cannot control. And that's an interesting human psychological trait as well.
Right. I would not recommend that, actually. Because obviously, let's say that you've experienced some adversity. Wallowing in it isn't going to help you overcome it or make the situation better. So you just have to do what you can, that's within your control to address it in some way.
I was having a conversation recently, and it just got onto the topic of trying to get out of life, and I used the word happiness and fulfillment, not interchangeably by any means, and the person I was talking with said, well, are we here? Are we meant to be happy? And I said, okay, I accept that, yes. And I said, okay, well, let's just take happiness as possibly a fleeting thing, even if it might hang around for extended periods. But fulfillment doesn't necessarily, overlap with that to any great extent. You can find fulfillment in something that's not necessarily very, very happy, depending, like, for example, you might find that helping that person in that car wreck was something that really added something, to your experience of life. I don't really know how to express it, but one of the other axioms in the book is essentially that best possible life isn't just about contentment. And that's another interesting balance to strike, because you don't want to be, if there's opportunity in adversity, does that mean you want a life exclusively of adversity? Possibly, probably not. But what is a life of complete, continuous contentment? What does that even look like? That sort of stasis. I think there's kind of a evolutionary push here, some kind of natural teleology that, even if you don't think there is any meaning and purpose ultimately in life, but I think there's something about these experiences of adversity or things being out of control that are there for us, for us to grow and for self-improvement, for development of virtue. And I think to seek constant contentment, whatever it looks like, whether it's, mental, emotional, physical, we tend to be thwarted in that, no matter what we do. And I think there's something in that, the fact that happens. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com